Alright, we're going to do the tutorial for Of Mice and Men, which is coming up here. So let's talk about the story itself. The story takes place around the 1930s during the Great Depression, and in this are some different aspects. I have some true-false, some matching, some multiple choice, and some subjective, which is short answer. And looking at some of the true-false, George... One of the questions is, does George tell Lenny about the farm before shooting him? And yes, he does. He has him look off into the lake, into the trees, so he can imagine it. And when George first goes to meet the boss, and Lenny's with him, he tells him to stay quiet when they meet the boss, not to talk. When they're in the barn, Lenny tends to not blame Curly's wife for the death of the puppy, but basically himself, because the thing's too little and he knows that he's done a bad thing and he's not going to be able to tend the rabbits. In the bunkhouse, one of the issues between Candy and Carlson is the fact that his dog stinks, and so Carlson kind of strong arms or forces him to shoot the dog, but Candy never asks for his dog to be shot, even though he allows Carlson to do it. At the end of the story, Slim is basically the only character who understands George's final action. Even though George didn't say anything, he figured it out and knew that George had stolen the gun and took care of Lenny himself. Slim was, because of his stature and on the ranch, he was considered and highly regarded by ranch workers because of his skill as a jerk-line skinner. Even though George and Lenny were not relatives, they were traveling companions as in best friends, with George looking out for Lenny. George, basically, him and Lenny planned one day to buy their own ranch, and it was their American dream. Lenny, of course, wasn't an aggressive individual, but he didn't know his own strength, so he tended to inflict pain on small animals, and sometimes whenever he got nervous would clench his fists around whatever it was he was holding, which would get him into trouble. Both Candy and Crooks were interested in George's plans to buy a ranch, even though in the end Crooks said he wasn't interested after basically his wife came in and told him that she'd have him lynched if he misspoke. Slim was considered essentially the prince of the ranch, while Curly's wife is just bored and restless on this ranch, kind of stuck in there as a somewhat of a prisoner in the sense. Crooks is the stable buck who lives out in the stable. Clara was Lenny's aunt, although we never see her. We hear about her through discussion between the two characters. Candy is the old swamper who's lost his hand and is getting to an age where he might be let go. Soledad is the town that's really outside of the ranch, whereas Weed is the town that they were running from being our main characters, George and Lenny. Curly, of course, is the boss's son. George basically tells Lenny that if there's any trouble at the very beginning of the story, to head for the brush and hide there until he can find him. And George ends up killing Lenny with Carlson's Luger, or his gun that he stole from him. The men joke about Curly because he wears a glove filled with Vaseline. He was to keep his hands soft for his wife. And Candy's afraid that pretty soon he will be useless and that they will fire him, and once they do, he has nowhere to go. George tells the boss when he's being interviewed that Lenny is his cousin and was kicked in the head by a horse, which is why he's not very intelligent. Curly does not like Lenny, essentially because he's a big guy, and Curly, who's not a big guy, tends to fight them. While Lenny and Curly's wife are in the barn, the men are out tossing horseshoes in a tournament. Curly's wife wants to basically know, how did Curly hurt his hand, even though she suspects that it was Lenny. George and Lenny left Weed because Lenny frightened a girl by grabbing her dress and not letting go and tearing it. After learning of the murder of basically Curly's wife, George essentially gives up the dream, because the dream is nothing without Lenny, which begs the question, whose dream is it? Is it Lenny's or is it George's? Which is very debatable. Whit's favorite cat house is Susie's place, which is essentially a whorehouse. And Lenny tends to, when in chapter 6, when he's dreaming, he dreams of Aunt Clara and a huge rabbit that he has an actual conversation with. Slim's job on the ranch is that he drives mules. He's a jerkline skinner. Some of the vocab that might be in it is contemptuously, and contemptuously basically means using disdain, okay, where you don't like something, you're angry. Ego is basically when you talk about yourself, and when Crooks reduces himself to nothing, there's no personality, no ego, no nothing to arouse any like or dislike about him. He basically, the ego is about the self. Lenny technically moves clumsily as if burdened, so that would be an example of he's lumbering when he walks. When you are dejected, that means you are sad or gloomy. And when Carlson, he steps back to let Slim precede him, that means when you precede somebody, you basically go out first, or you go first. Ominously is something that, like, say for instance, an example is George said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lenny, because Lenny ain't no fighter, but he's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. He's basically giving a, if this happens, watch out. And entranced is to be like in a, when you're looking at something, you're focused. That's when you are entranced in something. Sometimes it's beauty, sometimes it's something bad. If you try to conceal something, that means you try to hide it, and that's what Lenny tries to conceal a lot, is the dead mice. What is a motif? Well, motif is a reoccurring subject or a theme or idea, such as tending the rabbits, or living off the fat of the land, or getting a place of our own, or where's Curly's wife. What is an allusion? That's kind of like a figure of speech that makes reference to a story or a place or an event, or even a person for that matter. And in this one, the main theme of the story, it uses social commentary. That's conversation between people of that time period, back and forth, the American dream of owning their own land, and alienation and isolation of people. Okay, so looking at the short answers, one of the short answer questions is, what dream are George and Lenny working towards, and why do you think it's so important to them? We know that they're working to get their own place to stay, and it's important to them because at this point they finally won't be traveling from place to place to place. They have an actual place they can call home. And anybody who has traveled over and over again, if you go on vacation, the greatest feeling in the world is knowing that there's a place that you can come home to that's permanent, that is yours, and no one else can take that away from you. And it's important because it shows their independence, that they have family, that they've achieved something in their life. Another one of the questions is, why do you think that many men do not travel around together like Lenny and George in the story? And did it take Lenny's needing protection to create such a close friendship? Well, quite possibly, because during that time period, with the Great Depression, most men didn't trust other guys, and it was kind of odd to see two guys sharing the same path. Most men were considered strong, stout individuals who had no family. They had that rugged lifestyle, and so they didn't travel around because maybe they didn't trust each other, or they didn't like the way people saw or portrayed it, or maybe, quite frankly, they were afraid of what other people would say, or afraid of what would happen if they did travel together and building some sort of bond or friendship. I think that Steinbeck created the character of Lenny in a manner so that on a physical level he would be able to equal or be better than George, but on a mental level he would need caring, and George, it would allow him to be able to be humble or caring at times instead of a strong, bitter, or non-caring individual, and that's what created that friendship. Even if George and Lenny were able to get a piece of land and try to live off of it, do you think they would be successful, or do you think that they would need to have some sort of structure imposed by someone else? Explain. So you'd have to look at society. Everybody has to have rules, otherwise we'd have anarchy, and most people need rules in order to govern themselves or to live a certain code. You couldn't just wake up and say, I'm going to educate myself. You have to have a facility to go to that has rules and structure, with teachers that have rules and structures and a curriculum, so that you can drive towards a goal and achieve it and be successful by just giving somebody something and saying, okay, this is what you need to do, good luck with it, and you're on your own, it's not enough. At least with them trying to earn money to get their own place, they knew what they had to do in order to achieve it. But once they got it, would they be successful in keeping it? Would they actually be able to not work for anyone else for the rest of their life and just live off their own property? What would they do on that? If you think about that, like how would they pay to get seeds to plant stuff and rabbits and to keep up, the wood or the maintenance on their house? Do you think they would need another structure, such as finding another job also to help implement while they lived on their place? All right, so last question. Who wrote Of Mice and Men? And of course that is Steinbeck. Alright, that's the assessment. Remember that your written part, which is your short answer, you need to write in good paragraph form in order to get credit. Each of the short answers is 8 points each. So the other ones are worth 2 points apiece as well. Good luck, and if you need to, review this recording again.